Hey, what's up? It's Jake, and we're going to go over the module basics. Let's see. So, first place to start. So, you should have your files all set up, and we're going to start in the stage directory. And in this directory, we've got MySQL Network and Web Server Cluster. So, what we want to do is we want to remove all the files from Web Server Cluster and make it into a module. So before I go into that, so what is a module? A module is just a set of files in a folder. So this web server cluster, that's a module. This network folder, that's a module. This MySQL folder, that's a module. Everything is pretty much a module. They're not, very exciting modules, but they do something. So up to this point, I've been creating everything. You can see here, whenever you run Terraform apply, you're actually running it in the root module. So if you think of the stage web server directory as a folder that is also a module, then when you run Terraform apply, you're running the module inside of itself. So you're running the apply directly in what's called the root module. So if you see anything referencing root module, that's what that is. Um, so if we really want to see what we can do here, we need to use a module from another module. So you should have, and if you don't, a modules directory, go ahead and create one. And this should be in a top level folder. So you'll have global modules and stage should be what you have. So in this directory modules, what we're going to do is we've got this web server cluster. We're just going to copy all this stuff from here over to modules. So now in modules, I have a web server cluster module. Okay, so if I want to look at it this way, here are my directories, and in my modules folder should be a list of all my modules. Well, web server cluster is a module, so don't worry about what's in it. It's kind of like a list of things that you can use to build stuff. So web server cluster is now in my modules folder. So what we want to do is we actually want to remove everything from the web server cluster directory. We're gonna take all this out. So in order to do that, I have to let's go back into my stage web server cluster, and I don't want anything running in here, so I'm just gonna destroy everything that I have currently running. So we can basically destroy the stage environment of my web server cluster. All right, so we can get rid of all that stuff. I'm gonna go ahead and start tearing everything down. So in the meantime, what we're gonna do is just so you make sure we're on the same page, you should have a modules directory, and in there a web server cluster directory with a copy of everything from the original web server cluster from the stage directory. Okay. So now in the modules main folder, we want to make sure there's no provider. Okay, so it's not a module's job to declare a provider. It's the user's job to declare the provider. So we're just going to take that out. So once you move it to module, don't forget you need to remove the provider. As soon as you get that done, the next thing we'll do is we're actually going to make, we're going to use this module in a new file. And basically we're just going to make a new main file. So as soon as this is done, should be done here in like 10 seconds or so. What we're going to do is we're going to make a main file for web server cluster in the stage, but instead of having all this stuff declared, all we're going to do is we're going to have our provider at the top, and then instead of all this other stuff, I'll leave the remote backend, but all this other stuff that we're provisioning, this is all now part of our module. So we're just going to use, instead of creating a resource block, we're going to create a module block. So hopefully this finishes up soon. I'll actually go ahead and pause this while I'm waiting. All right, and we're all done. So let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing I want to do is I'm going to leave in my provider and my backend config, and I'm going to take everything else that's in here. I'm going to delete it. Okay. Now, I have my provider, I have my backend config. So now I'm just going to use module, and then I'm going to use the name of the module. So for this, that's web server cluster. Okay, and then I'm going to pass one parameter. Where's the source? Where's this module coming from? So we're currently in the web server cluster directory, right? So we need to go back a directory, and that'll put us in stage. And then we need to go back a directory to TF up and running 2. And then we're going to pass modules. And then in there, we've got web server cluster. Okay. And that is where it lives. So that's where all of our stuff lives. And it's just going to read this directory. And it's important because there's references and things like there, because I've got a data file and a main and an HTTPD shell script and stuff like that. So this is it. So this little 3 lines of code does the same thing as everything I just deleted, except now I can declare that anywhere. So I'm not going to make anything, but we definitely need to do an init, because when you do Terraform init, not only does it get your providers, but it's also going to add any module configuration, source parameters, anything like that. So I'm in stage web server cluster. I'm just going to run a Terraform init, and it's going to go, okay, we need to initialize this module, and it's going to go grab it. It's going to grab my backend. My backend configuration is ignored. Any selected backends configuration. Oh, you know what? I think it might be in my module. Hang on. It is. Let's take this out of my module, because you also don't want your backend config to be in your module. And go back to main, save, and let's run this one more time. All right, so it doesn't need to do the module, but does do the provider plugin, and we should be good to go. All right, so you could deploy this, and it would work just fine. But the next thing we can do, which is kind of cool, is we can actually do the same thing for prod environment. So we've had stage right here, so let's make a new directory called prod. And in this directory, I'm going to make a new main.tf file. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to go over to stage, and I'm basically just going to copy this sucker. I'm going to go over to prod, and then update anything for prod. So for this, like stage web, we want to have a prod web, and then our DynamoDB table will be prod web, and then it'll use the same exact, so my backend is different, but it's using the same exact module. So now I can deploy a prod environment and a stage environment. There's one issue with this. I don't know if you've figured out what this is, and while you're trying to think about that, I'm actually going to copy this and make sure I've got a prod version of everything. So we've got our prod, actually let me just do it this way. 1, 2, 3. Delete that. What I'm doing right now is I'm going to create 3 new DynamoDB tables. So we want a prod web with a name prod web, and we want a prod MySQL with a name prod MySQL, and then we want a prod network with the name prod network. Save. Let's go to global DynamoDB. Yeah, good. Okay, let's run a Terraform apply really quick and get us 3 new DynamoDB tables. The bucket remains the same. It's just going to add some new paths in there for us. So there's our 3 new DynamoDB tables for our Terraform locks. And then that should be that. Cool. All right, so now you got your DynamoDB tables. You're all set there. So did you think of what the problem was? The problem is your provider's fine, your bucket's fine, your DynamoDB table is fine. The names of everything when you use a module are going to be exactly the same. So let's go take a look at our module and see what it's doing. So whether you run it in prod or you run it in stage, you're going to have the same VPC name. You're going to have the same listener. You're going to have the same security group. You're going to have the same auto scaling. You're going to have the same template and the same template name, and you might want to have unique names for every environment, right? Because not only does that make sense, but Terraform's not going to build something like a security group, for example, if it already exists. So that's where we get into the next session, which is going to be module inputs. But for now, the init you've seen is kind of cool. It pulls in the modules, it pulls in the providers, does all that stuff, it sets up your backend. So don't run apply just yet because of this problem we're talking about with hard-coded names. So load balancer, security group, whatever, we need to get resolve these conflict errors before we start doing anything. The database details as well. If we go look at our database, you've got the name of your database that you might want to change, the identifier prefix, all that stuff you might want to make a little bit more dynamic. So that's the next thing we're going to do. We need to add configurable outputs so that every environment behaves differently. But essentially now you've seen how a provider would work and how to pull it in. And once you have one provider created, instead of retyping all this code, you can just grab this and call it good. We don't need this script anymore. We don't need this data file anymore. It's literally just a main file now, and all we do in there is to say, here's my provider, here's my backend, and hey, just run this module. So now you can go ahead and create your own modules, and anything you have that's kind of cool, like, hey, I want my, little piece of infrastructure to be its own individual module, and start breaking things down and making them more granular, and kind of like you would with microservices. Then you can just stick all those in your modules folder and call them whenever you need, so long as you provide the proper source path. Run an init so it imports that module and initializes it, then you should be good to go. So if you have any questions on module basics, let me know, but if not, you're off to a good start.